Hello, my name is Carrie and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing my July wrap up. The first half of July was pretty busy for me. I was teaching during our summer camp and then I was doing a professional development project. So the month was a little bit busier than I expected, but by the end of the month, things were definitely slowing down, which was nice. I was able to read 11 books in the month of July. And now let's take a look at my statistics for the month. Of those 11 books, 4 were physical copies, 5 were audiobooks, and 2 were ebooks. This is now the second month in a row where I am slowly pushing back at my audiobook statistics. I have been really diversifying reading between physical and ebook copies, and I'm really happy to see that my audiobook amount is kind of decreasing because I have too many physical books and ebooks to be only reading audiobooks. In terms of author backgrounds, I read 1 book each by a Black author and an Asian author. I read 6 books by white authors and 2 books by Latinx authors. I also read 1 book by an Indigenous author. This author is a part of the Chunaka Nation, which is in present-day Canada, which leads me to my next statistic. The countries that I read from were Canada, the United States, Ireland, Argentina, and Indonesia. And of the 11 books that I read, there were 4 books that had queer themes in them. Last but not least, my average star rating for the month was a 3.5 star. I'm actually very shocked that it's this high. I thought it would be lower because I had quite a few 2-star reads for the month, but I think it balanced out because I didn't have a lot of 3-star reads. Next, let's talk about the actual books themselves. I am first going to do a brief overview of the 3 books that I read that were a part of my Cozy Mystery vlog. These were sequels to mystery series I had already started. The first one is Deserts, Derelicts, and Driving by Tonya Kappes. Then it was Calypso, Corpses, and Cooking by Racquel v. Reyes. And finally, Vera Wong's Guide to Snooping on a Dead Man by Jessie Q. Sutanto. Those 3 I cover in more specific detail and discuss why I rated them the way that I did in my vlog, so I'm not going to talk about them here. I also want to briefly discuss a series update of a series that I started in July and really want to kind of dedicate time in this video to talk about, and that is the Daevabad trilogy by S.A. Chakraborty. I started the month of July with City of Brass, and this was an unintentional book club read because one of my friends, she had a copy of it and started reading it. She was telling our other friends about the book, and then slowly through the month, we all started sharing the books to continue on the series. The premise of this series is we meet Nari, who I think is in her late teens, early 20s in the first book, and she is living in historic Cairo in the period where the Ottomans have just been forced out and the French are starting to come in. She doesn't remember her parents. She knows her native language is a language she hasn't heard anyone else speak. And she's got these powers that she doesn't know where they came from, but they help her to heal people. So she's been working as a healer in her society, obviously precariously. One night there's a ritual that she is performing that kind of goes wrong, and she accidentally ends up summoning this creature called Dara. And then Dara tells her that she is from this long lost family and needs to go back to the capital of the Jinn world called Daevabad. And thus starts their adventure in the first book. I thought the first book was good. I really liked Nari and Dara and their companionship that we see throughout that first book. We're also introduced to another main character who's the other POV we get in the first book, and his name is Ali. He is the younger son of the king of the capital, well, really the whole Jinn kingdom, and he's very naive, a bit of a religious fanatic, and he has very specific ideas of the world in black and white and doesn't really understand the middle area that his father and older brother really play within. It's a very frustrating experience at times reading from Ali's perspective because he is so sure of his ideas, and he is one of those people who you realize they don't have enough life experience, they don't have enough understanding of the world and the society and structures that we live in, that sometimes things are not simply black and white. And it was really interesting having that perspective paired with Nari, who is also naive, but more so naive of the society that she is now living in and her family has a very tragic history with. This leads her to be very cautious of the people around her. Also, she struggles because Dara is this person that brought her here, and yet Dara and her never seem to get their timing right in making time to stay connected or to inform each other of things. There's this real tension that's building in the first book where you know something is going to happen, but you don't know quite yet what. And the ending of the first book was really phenomenal. But overall, I would say the first book was more of a 4-star read for me. It wasn't anything that was absolutely amazing throughout. I thought there was good groundwork for the characters and the world, but book 2 took everything to another level for me. I was so shocked with how book 2 really advanced this story, not just in terms of the storylines, but in terms of the characters, the depth and development that we get from them, the world itself and how the lore of it is expanded on, and the intensity of the political machinations in the second book and how these things shape the characters and their choices, their lack of choices. And that ultimately leads to shaping what I consider to be one of the most amazing endings I've ever read to a sequel. That truly, for me, just elevated that second book. And all of these things together shaped the second book that really pushed this series into the adult fantasy genre, because I felt like in the first book, it was much more middling young adults kind of trying to get into adult. And this book, I think, really set the tone that this is a series that's going to get more and more intense as it goes along. I know there's only one book left in the trilogy and then there's a short story collection, but I'm really intrigued as to how this is possibly going to intensify in the third book, because the ending to book 2 completely shocked me. I was just in awe of how the pieces had been laid out for certain events to happen and how it ended up all coming together, because you know very early on into the second book what the most climatic moment of that book is going to be, but the way it's executed is just phenomenal. And this leaves me both excited and a little bit anxious for book 3, because I'm not sure how she can really top this one, but I don't doubt that S.A. Chakraborty definitely has the skills to outdo herself with this last book. So I wanted to talk about those a little bit separately, because when I look at my other books throughout the month, I feel like they fall into some pretty specific categories. There were the bad books, and then the surprising books, and then one book that rivals Kingdom of Copper for my favorite book of the month. So there's not a lot of books that are in the middle, so this is how I've kind of divided them up into categories for me to talk about for the rest of this video. And I think we should start with the bad. First, I want to talk about Imagined Communities by Benedict Anderson. I don't know why I felt this urge to read this book this month. I have been thinking about this book for a while now because I read parts of it in my undergraduate studies. It's often cited by history, anthropology, sociology, even political science professors as a book that is pivotal in understanding the rise of nationalism. I read excerpts of it in school, so I wanted to go back and read the whole thing. And having read the whole thing, I understand why at the time it came out, it was very popular, and the theory that Benedict Anderson proposed was so fascinating. However, I'm kind of shocked that it's still so revered, because there's such a limitation of scope in this book. Benedict Anderson is arguing that there were really 2 types of nationalism. One was a more like top-down approach in former colonizing countries, where they had national movements within their country after the decline of monastic regimes and the religious influence. Then there's the second type of nationalism, which is pirated nationalism, where former colonized countries try to replicate nationalistic movements from their former colonizers. And this is where I think there were some flaws in the argument here, because in looking at the countries that Benedict Anderson examines for this, there's kind of a flaw in his logic, because some of the countries he's leaving out of the narrative of this book directly contradict the things that he's discussing. One big example is Turkey. I was really surprised that this was not talked about in this book, because Benedict Anderson's whole argument of why nationalism rose in the decline of these monastic dynasties and religious influence is because of language that was used to build nationalistic imagined communities, mainly through the spread of print media. And I think Turkey is a prime example of this, and yet it wasn't included in here because it would have directly contradicted most of Benedict Anderson's thesis about top-down nationalism versus pirated nationalism. I think that there are just flaws in the scope of this book. I can understand it being examined through this one issue that Benedict Anderson found fascinating. However, there are many other causes of nationalism, many of which have a much greater influence than print media. I can definitely say that, obviously language is a big part of nationalism and nationalistic movements, and we see that in many different countries, but I don't know if print media is the exact reason for that. When we consider things like educational systems, religious influence that he is denying is a factor, and yet look at how many countries speak the same language because of a major religion that they follow. I mean, yeah, I just had real issues with the argument in this. I also take issue with the fact that I read the updated edition, which was updated in 2006. So there had been almost 20 years since this book had published. And instead of updating the edition in the final chapter, he spends the entire final chapter talking about how people love his book. It's been translated into all of these languages. People are singing his praises. And I thought that was so self-congratulatory and honestly bullshit, because why would you not take that opportunity to update the book and maybe expand upon things, especially considering the rise of nationalistic movements that we were seeing in different countries around 2006? I don't understand why the choice was made to instead spend that time just patting yourself on the back. It was very absurd to me. I gave this one 2 stars. I keep questioning if I should just lower it to 1 star, because the more that I think about this book, the more it just reminds me of dense, pompous, pretentious academia that I really get annoyed by. I don't know why I felt this urge to read it, but I guess I can say at least I did it. The next book I didn't dislike as much as Imagined Communities, but I still had big issues with it, and that is Born Sacred, Poems for Palestine by Smokii Sumac. I had real issues with this book. One of the biggest ones is that the original description of the book made it seem that this author was Palestinian, and that is not the case. This author is indigenous. So then once the description was updated, it made it seem like this book was going to be kind of similar to David Gruel's From Turtle Island to Gaza collection, which is examining the struggles of indigeneity across different continents and how there is this shared interconnectivity of indigenous struggles all around the globe, which is something that I would still definitely have wanted to read. And I can see the attempts at that in this collection. However, a big problem that I had with this collection was that I think it was uncomfortably centered on the poet's own experiences and not centered enough on the shared struggles between indigenous communities, specifically Palestinians. I also felt like it was just this complete overshadowing of voices that we already have available. There are already Palestinian poets in the world. There are Palestinian poets who are from Gaza, and I don't think that this collection was necessary, because in moments like this, I think it's more important to step aside and really amplify Palestinian voices whose testimonies speak directly to their lived experiences. I'm not denying that the poet has a point and that there is a shared experience with Palestinians and the struggle for indigenous rights and for indigenous land. However, that was not often expressed enough in this poetry collection. It felt more like a memoir of the poet, and so I have a real issue with it being called Poems for Palestine when I don't see that Palestine is necessarily centered in this collection. I gave this collection 2.5 stars. I see the attempts by this author to expand upon the themes that this collection is proposing that it will discuss. However, I don't think this collection should have been marketed in the way that it was marketed. And so that makes it really difficult as a reader, because I don't think this is something I would recommend to someone, even though I can see there are parts of this collection that do have value. Now let's talk about some books that surprised me. The first one I want to talk about is Things We Lost in the Fire by Mariana Enríquez, and this was translated from the Spanish by Megan McDowell. I actually DNF'd this book quite a few years ago. I had a physical copy, and at the time hadn't read a lot of horror or also more abstract stories. And so I really struggled with the first 2 stories, and I ended up putting it down. Recently, an audiobook became available through my library, and I decided, why not just try it? I am really glad that I did, because I really appreciated these stories much more this time around. I was better prepared for the language in these. I was also better prepared for the dark depths that this was going to go into, because these stories are not the classic like creature features or ghost stories. They are much more about the moral decay of society, people facing poverty, addiction, gender-based violence, and other realities that are, I think, almost more haunting because they are something we can all really imagine, and that is terrifying at times, especially in this collection. I think that the language in this was just absolutely amazing, and it was so atmospheric. This is not a very loud, gory collection. This is a quiet, gothic collection that really ruminates with you, and a lot of the endings were very ambiguous, which I think suits these types of stories where it's left to your imagination because you can imagine the very terrifying things that this collection is reflecting on. Yeah, I really enjoyed this one. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars, and it makes me intrigued to read more by Mariana Enríquez because I used to be very afraid that her books were going to scare me too much, and maybe they will not. Next is a book that I haven't really seen a lot of people talking about, and it's Gulf by Mo Ogrodnik. This is such a fascinating book to me. I was really blown away by the writing in this. The author is a filmmaker, and I think that that shows in the way that she writes because her writing was very imaginative and vivid. It felt like I could picture every single scene, and there was an intensity that was really built up through the writing in this. However, I will say that did lead to some problems with character development, and for this being a literary fiction, I wanted a little bit more, especially from one of the characters who we get very limited glimpses of. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Gulf is a literary fiction that is about 5 women who, through various different circumstances, end up in Gulf countries, and some of the women's stories intersect through these experiences. I don't want to say too much about the women and their stories, but I will say that there is a real variety in the women who are shown in this story. This is about women and their experiences, whether that be in motherhood, in caretaking, in even the opportunities that are available to them or the lives that they think they are able to live based on certain circumstances and environments. It's just something that was so fascinating to read. It was really hard to put this book down because I kept wondering what would happen next. What are we going to learn about this character? Where is this story going to go? It was a really, really well-written novel, and I am looking forward to whatever this author, or if this author ends up putting something out next. I know that she's a filmmaker, so this was her first foray into writing fiction, but I hope that this means she is willing to write more because I think that her voice is really unique in literary fiction, and it's something that really stuck out to me, which is hard sometimes in this genre. But overall, yeah, I really enjoyed this, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Okay, I'm hoping this is the same angle because there was a delivery that came, and in my rush to get to the door, I knocked my camera down, so I am hoping we're in at least the same setup. The last surprising read was the Bromance Book Club by Lyssa K. Adams. This is a second chance romance, and it was actually supposed to be a book club pick, but then only one other person ended up reading it for our book club. And I was so sad because I actually really enjoyed this book. Many of my book club members are not big romance people, and they said that before this book was picked. But the concept of this is so interesting. There is a baseball player who his wife has told him that you have never actually given me an orgasm. It leads to this fight between them, and this leads to bigger problems in their marriage coming up and them announcing that they're getting divorced. His teammates help him try to win her back, and a part of this is doing this like study of a Regency romance where they are trying to get him to understand you need to see what kind of support your wife needs, why she might not be talking about things, and you need to understand where you're failing in communicating with her. And it was just such a lovely book. I really loved the characters in this. I think it was so unique in getting most of this romance book from the male character's perspective, and I really loved how developed and well-rounded he felt, and also how this changed the perspective of the entire situation for me as a reader, because oftentimes I feel that the male main characters are not really fully formed, or there's only a certain extent of their emotions that we're getting to understand. Even in dual POV books, there are times where I have issues with this. In this one, I had the complete opposite experience, where I felt that I could very clearly understand the male main character's decisions, his reasons for things, and I didn't feel like our female main character's development suffered for that. I think that both of them were really strong characters, and I loved both of them. I was rooting for them. I think there are very difficult things being discussed in this book that might be hard for some readers, and it might be difficult to move past those because they are very sad scenarios, but there's also a mix of more happier moments and these moments that aren't just filler content, like they are serving a purpose in the grander narrative of the story. But I think that this is a story that could have easily been overwhelmingly tragic and sad, and yet the author struck a really good balance of being like, hey, this is a serious situation, but also there are times where even in these difficult moments in a relationship, you still need to have fun together, and you have children, and you need to provide a certain atmosphere for those children. And I really loved the way this was written. I did not expect to love this book as much as I did. I definitely want to continue on with the series. I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. I'm not saying that this book is flawless, and I can see where a lot of people may not like it, especially because of the nested Regency romance that's in this, because we do get chapters like from the romance book, which I thought was really interesting, and I really appreciated how that was done. But I can see where for some people they would not be interested in that at all. However, it did tickle my fancy, and I'm hoping that the other books in the series live up to this first one for me. And last but not least, I have to talk about my most beloved book of the month. This book is definitely up there tied with Kingdom of Copper for me in terms of my favorite book of the month, but they're favorites for completely different reasons. And this book is They Can't Kill Us Until They Kill Us by Hanif Abdurraqib. I knew I was gonna have feelings about this book because I love Hanif Abdurraqib's writing in terms of his poetries and some of his one-off essays that I've read. This is a collection of his essays, and I have to say that I was pretty intimidated and nervous about how it would go. And I guess like the fluidity or the connectivity of that through these longer works. So I was worried, and I definitely shouldn't have been, because Hanif Abdurraqib is just such a prolific writer. This collection of essays is unlike anything I've ever read before. It feels so underwhelming to say that it is a collection of stories about music, because it's so much more than that. It's about music, it's about culture, it's about lived experiences and grief and love and heartbreak, all of these emotions and beautiful, heartbreaking reflections that at times are so incredibly sad and other times so incredibly beautiful, and I can't find the words. And Hanif Abdurraqib seems like he can continually find the perfect words for everything, because I don't think I understood before this book people who said that they love all music or that they appreciate all cultures connected to that music, because I think there's often a disconnect between where music comes from and the music itself. I had a conversation with students earlier this school year about the Cowboy Carter album, and my students not understanding why this album became album of the year and was so beloved and all of these things, and explaining to them some of the background of certain songs, some of the significance of the imagery of the people chosen to be featured on this album. Having those types of conversations with students who are so removed from the culture and don't understand American culture very well, but especially African American culture, which has shaped most of mainstream American culture, and how that then becomes controversial when we talk about issues of cultural appropriation or the policing of certain stories within these genres and within these narratives of African Americans and their history in the United States. That conversation is something that I kept going back to when reading this book, because I realized more the significance of having that conversation with them and explaining to them it's not just music. There is a whole world behind the music that is created and the artists that create them. I don't know that I'm explaining it well or that I'm articulating my thoughts on it very well, but it was just unlike anything I've ever read before in the best of ways. I'm just so appreciative of Hanif Abdurraqib's writing and that he has shared his writing with the world. His prose is beyond moving. It is heartfelt and vulnerable and raw, and there's just not a lot of people that I can think of that write like him, and this collection perfectly exemplified that. I'm desperately hoping that one day he will do an updated edition to this where he talks about more recent things, because as I was reading this, I was constantly wondering what are his thoughts on Cowboy Carter, the Kendrick and Drake feud, the immense stardom of Taylor Swift around the world, not even just in the United States. You know, there are all these current media controversies and media hot takes that I know some of them he's written pieces on here and there, but I definitely wanted more and more of his thoughts, because I could read about his thoughts on everything from his grocery list to a critical analysis of any album in the world. I really, really loved this. And it makes me excited because I do have his book on basketball, which makes me very, very excited because I am a huge basketball fan, especially college basketball. However, I don't know if I will read that one this year. I might read it around the start of college basketball season, or I might read it in March Madness times. We will see, because I don't want to read all of his works back to back. I want to give myself time and space with them. But anyways, those are all the books that I read in the month of July. If you've read any of these books, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. I hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you so much for watching. Happy reading. Bye.